Tantor Audio presents The Invaders, How Humans and Their Dogs Drove Neanderthals to Extinction, by Pat Shipman, narrated by Donna Postel. 1. And he is us. Most books about science do not open by declaring that some of the most revered scientists in the world have made a big mistake. But here goes. They're wrong. Although it is almost universally acknowledged in the scientific community that invasive species are a terrible problem, altering ecosystems, causing extinctions, lessening biodiversity, there is a glaring omission in our catalog of invasive species. You can check for yourself by going to the website wikipedia.org/wiki/list of globally invasive species, where you will find a list of the 100 worst invasive species, drawn from the Global Invasive Species Database. That list is maintained by the Invasive Species Specialist Group of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. In other words, some of the most knowledgeable, clever, concerned, and well-informed people in the world are worrying about invasive species and the ways in which they are changing our world. They are compiling data, making lists, and documenting impacts of invasive species. What species are on the list? A number of the names will be familiar to most people interested in conservation, ecology, or whole organism biology. There are invasive mammals, such as house mice, Carolina gray squirrels, and brush-tail possums. Birds, like the myna and the English starling. Plants, including kudzu, purple loosestrife, and prickly pear. Insects, such as the malaria-carrying Anopheles mosquitoes, Asian gypsy moths, and red fire ants. Mollusks, including zebra mussels, apple snails, and giant African snails, and numerous others. Cane toads, Nile perch, brown tree snakes, Dutch elm disease, and the chytrid frog fungus. The list goes on, and it is extraordinary for the breadth of organisms represented and the extent of the geographic distribution of these creatures. But there is one telling and very serious gap in such lists. The most invasive, most environment-altering species of all, the one that has contributed to or directly caused the extinctions of thousands of species and the alteration of almost every habitat you can think of, is not on the list. If you go to the Global Invasive Species Database and search the entire list, not just the 100 worst offenders, and type in Homo sapiens, our species, the following answer comes up. No invasive species currently recorded. Why not? Maybe because we humans, Homo sapiens, are the ones writing the list, and we do not want to face our culpability. As a wise and eponymous possum in Walt Kelly's cartoon Pogo said in a 1971 Earth Day poster, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." So he is. So we are. I maintain that humans are the most invasive species that has ever lived. From a modest evolutionary beginning in Africa about 200,000 years ago, our kind has spread across the entire world, invading geographic region after geographic region, settling in to exploit new habitats until we can now be found living on every continent. We live in the sweltering tropics, in the far cold north, on tops of mountains and in deep valleys, on islands and continents and island continents, in deserts, in rainforests, in temperate forests, and in open environments or closed ones. We do not live underwater, except in artificial habitats like submarines, but many humans live in boats or on floating villages in lakes and rivers. We have become established in nearly every habitat on Earth. It is an awful and awe-inspiring record. The adaptability, cunning, and technology that make our enormous geographic distribution possible also mean that our invasive success is unparalleled by any other species. We adapt ourselves to an incredibly broad range of habitats, lifestyles, diets, and climates. We adapt by the recording and sharing of knowledge through our exceptional language skills. We do this not only biologically, but also through the invention and use of cultural buffers, like clothing, fire, shelter, the capture and transport of water, and the planting of crops. Some of these can be considered tools, items constructed to be used, and others are behaviors. We also create and use tools that have allowed us to circumvent the long process of evolutionary change as a way of expanding our resources and skills. For example, we have not evolved sharp cutting teeth for slicing up food. We have invented first stone tools, then metal ones, and various implements to facilitate cutting made from almost every substance imaginable. We have even invented and manufactured living tools by domesticating other animals, by controlling their breeding until their genes produce the attributes we want. Then, because a domestic species and a domesticating species form a kind of covenant or pact, we are able to borrow some of the domesticated species' anatomical and behavioral skills, such as their superior eyesight and hearing, their speed in locomotion, their tremendous power, their cutting teeth, quick paws, and deadly claws, and their intensely specific sense of smell. This arrangement seems to work to our advantage, but I caution that a nuanced view is more realistic. Living tools, like horses, dogs, cats, cattle, or pigs, are not passive, but active participants. If they do not want to and agree to work with us, they do not work to our advantage at all. Domestication is a continually negotiated agreement between two species, not an enslavement of one by the other. And some species flatly refuse to be domesticated. Even though the domestication of plants has involved less negotiation, what such plants have given us has been essential to our worldwide success as a species and our ever-increasing population. It has not been a one-way street, however. Plants have benefited from their domestication by increased fertility, larger seeds, protection from animals, or simple boons like watering. There has been a serious price for our success in worldwide terms. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have decimated millions of acres of once productive land until the soil has eroded into the seas. This practice continues. We have cut down or burned vast areas of forest and woodland and prairie that once produced oxygen to replenish our atmosphere, as well as fruit, leaves, roots, and nuts to feed ourselves and many other creatures. We have single-handedly accounted for the pollution, poisoning, and drying up of innumerable water sources around the world, thanks to our insatiable and growing needs, our toxic chemicals, and our enormous piles of debris. More than all this, we have contributed to the extinction of more species than we can calculate. I am not alone in laying the blame at our own doorstep. In 2005, ecologists David Burney and Tim Flannery wrote a review article called 50 Millennia of Catastrophic Extinctions After Human Contact. The title tells most of the story. Time after time, in place after place, humans have spread into new areas, and shortly after our appearance, numerous other species have gone extinct. As Burney and Flannery maintain, there is a global pattern of human arrival, followed by faunal collapse and other ecological changes, without known exception. Think about that. A global pattern of faunal collapse. In many cases, the now extinct parts of the fauna included many large mammals, birds, or reptiles. Large animals are more vulnerable to extinction because they reproduce more slowly than small animals, thus making the loss of any reproductive age adults more serious. and larger animals need larger ranges or territories to live in, so they are more vulnerable to habitat loss, too. Since Paul Martin started writing about this pattern at length in 1967, the phenomenon has been called megafaunal extinction. The devastation we have wrought does not stop with animals, but includes plants, too. In another recent article, an impressive team of ecologists writes, "Modern extinctions are largely being caused by a single species, Homo sapiens. And, from its onset in the late Pleistocene, this mass extinction has been characterized by the loss of larger-bodied animals in general, and of apex consumers in particular." The loss of apex consumers is arguably humankind's most pervasive influence on the natural world. An apex consumer is one at the top of the heap, a species that directly or indirectly consumes all the non-predatory biomass in the ecosystem. We are apex consumers, of course, and we have deliberately or unconsciously worked hard to eliminate any other apex species that might compete with us in every ecosystem we have entered. In some historical instances, climate change disrupted ecosystems and initiated an apparent population decline in some large mammals, leaving them especially vulnerable to human activities. Yet there can be little doubt that human invasion was but not necessarily the only, key factor in triggering extinctions on the large land masses of Eurasia, Australia, and the Americas, in the circumpolar regions, on numerous islands, and on the island continent of Madagascar. I would not claim that the arrival of humans has been the only factor contributing to many extinctions, but a spate of extinctions following human settlement is the norm. Apex predators are especially influential and powerful in shaping an ecosystem. Marine ecologist Robert Stenick of the University of Maine observes, "Studies from widely divergent ecosystems all found a single predator can control the distribution, abundance, body size, and species diversity in the system." The human role in extinctions is easiest to prove on small islands, where the limits of resources vital to the survival of the indigenous species are more obvious. But even on a continental basis, there is good evidence of the human role in the loss of mammoths and mastodons, of aurochs and wild horses, of many larger Madagascan lemurs, of dodos in Mauritius, and of moas in New Zealand. We humans have helped kill off amazing giant marsupials, enormous predatory birds, and lovely passenger pigeons, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinos, fearsome dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats, as well as other species that managed to survive changing climates, until humans came along. Human predation is not the sole factor in all of these extinctions, but we cannot escape the conclusion that we have played a crucial role in them. This book looks at a particularly pivotal point in our history, the time during which the last species of non-human hominin, Neanderthals, went extinct. I argue here that Neanderthal extinction was triggered by the appearance of modern humans in Neanderthals' geographic range. Simply put, humans are a supremely well-adapted invasive species, and we behaved exactly like one during this extinction event. I have been pleased to find other anthropologists expressing similar views, and I try to give full credit here to others when credit is due. Why our close cousins the Neanderthals died out has puzzled paleoanthropologists ever since Neanderthals were first recognized as a species in 1856. As more fossils, modern research, and new techniques of analysis have proliferated, the extinction of a species with such familiar attributes, with the ability to make fire, to manufacture and use tools, to cooperate socially, to take down large mammals, to use symbols, art, and communication to at least some extent, has continued to seem enigmatic. But once you understand what makes a successful invasive species, and which factors determine its impact on the ecosystem it invades, You will puzzle no longer. 2. Here we come, ready or not. What exactly is an invasive species? Perhaps the simplest definition is that it is a species that moves into a new geographic region where it has not previously, historically, lived. The species that are invaded, those that are indigenous to an area without human intervention, are considered native. An endemic species is a subset of native ones, comprising those that have evolved in a particular area and are found only there. An invader is neither of these. It is a species that does not belong in the region. An invader is non-indigenous, non-native, non-endemic, alien, and very often disruptive to the ecosystem. The U.S. government legally defines an alien species as being, with respect to a particular ecosystem, any species, including its seeds, eggs, spores, or other biological material capable of propagating that species, that is not native to that ecosystem. By this same executive order, an invasive species is defined as an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. What this means is that a species that is not disruptive to the ecosystem or harmful to humans is not technically considered invasive. This is a somewhat short-sighted and anthropocentric point of view. How is a species invasion different from a geographic expansion? The distinction lies in a question of timescale, distance, and influence. Expanding a species' territory by a few miles probably will have a negligible impact on the ecosystem as a whole. Expanding a species' distribution from one habitat or ecosystem or continent to another, across a mountain range or other formidable geographic barrier, is considered an invasion, as this change is more likely to have far-reaching effects. Ecosystems are complex entities, crisscrossed and bound together by webs of cooperation, symbiosis, and mutual dependencies. The close relations among species within an ecosystem are stretched, warped, and complicated by competition, mutually exclusive needs, complementary needs, and the uncertainties of coexistence. Dropping a wholly new organism into the mix can disrupt the functioning of the entire system, unless the new organism is so ill-adapted it dies out without becoming established as a viable, continuing population. An invasive or non-indigenous species is easily defined in theory, but not in practice. If a native or indigenous species is one that has been part of the local ecosystem for a considerable length of time, the key question is, how long? How many years, centuries, or millennia must a species be part of an ecosystem to be considered native? In the United States, 500 years in a particular ecosystem is often used as the Rubicon that divides native from non-native, alien, or invasive. Ecologists who focus on living organisms tend to think in a very short time frame, perhaps a few human lifetimes, and 500 years is a convenient dividing line. I regard this short time frame as a weakness in a very strong field. Since its inception, invasion biology has been closely tied to conservation efforts and strategies, so changes that occur within a relatively short time span garner lots of attention. Such changes can be seen, measured, and documented. It is much harder to see and understand the causes of an invasion when your time frame is thousands or tens of thousands of years. In contrast, paleontologists and paleoanthropologists like me are far more comfortable thinking in terms of hundreds of thousands of years. The advantage of considering a long time span is that great evolutionary and biological truths and trends can be seen clearly. Are animals that evolved in Asia and entered the Americas, such as humans, mammoths, horses, and wolves, considered indigenous if they have been on this continent for 20,000 years? What about 10,000 years? A mere 500 years is not long enough to see massive effects from an evolutionary perspective, except in very short-lived species that have short generation times. The greater time depth that is involved in evolutionary studies means that I think about invasive species and resulting extinctions slightly differently from the way most invasion biologists do. The weakness here is that many short-term fluctuations, changes that may last hundreds of years and wreak havoc on individual species, can be very hard to detect in geological time. We paleontologists and evolutionary biologists may take too long a view in some instances. On the whole, I believe understanding the principles of invasion biology will help resolve some long-standing questions in evolutionary biology. Sometimes looking at a short-term effect provides the key to understanding a long-term one. To properly explain the hypotheses and conclusions that underlie this book, I have to be perfectly clear what I mean by an invasive species. The working definition I use goes beyond moving into a historically new territory. One criterion for determining whether a species is invasive or not often involves its impact. Invasiveness is not an all-or-nothing event. To qualify as an invasive species, an organism must progress through a series of sequential steps. First comes arrival. The alien species must get to a new ecosystem by some mechanism, which in modern times often involves humans. Invasive species hitchhike, catching rides on boats or planes or cars, lying hidden in bilge water, in containers, in personal luggage, in the folds of our clothing, or inside our bodies. Sometimes larger invasive species are brought along purposefully by humans, who view them as a kind of insurance that they will have in new habitats, the species of animals that are important to them. As an example, people have carried not only domesticated animals, but also deer, moose, rabbits, and innumerable plants around the world. Inadvertently, we have also spread many insects and parasites. We humans do not like to travel alone. Second, the invader must establish itself as a viable wild population. As a ballpark figure, the smallest population of mammals, known as the minimum viable population, MVP, is usually considered to be 1,000 individuals. If there are fewer than that, the lack of genetic diversity may lead to a high frequency of deleterious mutations because of inbreeding. Small populations are also more vulnerable than large ones to random events like hurricanes, disease epidemics, or drought. A small founder population can be wiped out in a very short time by such events. But an article published in 2007 on this topic suggested that an MVP lower than 1,000 individuals might be adequate. My concern is that an MVP is routinely defined as one that has a 95% chance of being around 100 years later. 100 years? That is an undetectable blip in paleontology, not long-term survival, though 100 years is a long time in human experience. A human generation is generally calculated as 20 years, so 100 years is 5 generations. Few of us can trace our family tree so far back. From my perspective, if you are trying to calculate long-term survival, 1,000 individuals may be way too few because random chance, local or global catastrophe, or minor change can eliminate a 1,000 individual population easily. Let's consider a good analogy for the case of modern humans invading Eurasia. The peopling of Australia. What is advantageous about doing this is that there were absolutely no humans or hominins of any kind on the Australian continent prior to the arrival of modern humans. So there is no question of confusing archaeological sites or tools made by one species of hominin with those made by another. Such confusions are often a problem in Eurasia. Also, the peopling of Australia occurred in a time frame of 48,000 to 46,000 years ago, just about when modern humans first got to Eurasia as well. We can expect that the first modern humans to get to Australia had abilities roughly comparable to those of the first modern humans to reach Eurasia, with the added proviso that the first human invaders to reach Australia must have had watercraft and considerable knowledge of seafaring. So what happened? And how many were needed to people Australia? A recent study by Alan Williams of the Australian National University calculated the number of humans who invaded Australia about 45,000 years ago in a clever way. It has usually been assumed by anthropologists that a small number of people, perhaps 50 to 100, colonized Australia. Williams set out to test this assumption mathematically. First, he compiled a database of every radiocarbon-dated, well-documented archaeological site in Australia prior to European contact, which amounted to just over 5,000 sites. Then he used the numbers of sites through time as a proxy for population numbers, based on the reasonable premise that more people leave more sites. This allowed him to calculate relative growth rates of the human population over time, even though he did not know how big the initial or founder population was. He could ask how long it took for the founder population to double, or triple, or increase tenfold. Once he knew the population's growth rate, he could calculate backward from the size of the Aboriginal population at European contact in about 1788 to see how big the founder population must have been. Estimates vary between 770,000 and 1.2 million Aboriginal individuals in 1788. The number is not precise because European contact brought European diseases, which decimated many Aboriginal groups within just a few years, not to mention the deliberate killing of many Aborigines by European settlers. And no systematic census of the entire continent was conducted either. Still, working from good estimates of population densities in various areas, the early European settlers got a reasonable idea of the numbers of Aborigines in Australia. Surprisingly, Williams found that if the founding population of Australia had been between 50 and 150 individuals, as had always been assumed, then the Aboriginal population would have been no larger than 19,000 at European arrival. Although early population estimates of Aborigines in Australia may have been imprecise, they would have had to have been insanely inaccurate to mistake fewer than 20,000 individuals for more than 500,000. Clearly, a founding population of 50 to 150 Aborigines was not adequate to produce the observed population of 770,000 to 1.2 million Aborigines at European contact. In fact, to produce the Aboriginal population numbers at contact that fit the historical records of the contact period, the founding population must have been much bigger, between 1,000 and 3,000 individuals. This large number of founders bespeaks intentionality, according to Williams, and impressive watercraft. It's not just a family that got stuck on a raft and washed away, he says. It's people with the intention to move, to explore. Since Australia was separated from the next nearest landmass by at least 80 kilometers of open ocean, watercraft must have been used to transport the immigrants. Prior to invading Australia, Aboriginals probably relied on seafaring for obtaining food on a regular basis. Because the number of Aborigines reaching Australia is so much larger than had been assumed, and yet not much larger than an ecologist would predict for an MVP, the Aboriginal boats observed by Europeans at contact seemed too small and not sufficiently sturdy to have carried such a large number of people such a distance. Had Aborigines forgotten some of their seafaring skills in the thousands of years between their invasion and that of modern Europeans? Apparently. The record suggests that the fishing and seafaring habits of the founding Aborigines were largely abandoned for a...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?